Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We're delighted to be hosting this program today, looking at the situation in Iraq, and we're delighted to welcome a stellar panel of speakers who I will introduce very quickly here and then share their full bios with you in the chat function. First, I'm happy to welcome Ambassador Rend, the co-founder and president of the Iraq Foundation, a nonprofit organization committed to the support and promotion of democracy, human rights, and civil society in Iraq. She has been active in the Iraqi public arena, civic leadership, and human rights and democracy advocacy. From November 2003 to March 2005, she joined the Iraqi Diplomatic Service, serving as Iraq's Chief of Mission to the United States. I'm also happy to welcome our friend, Dr. Abbas, the director of the Iraq Initiative and senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Atlantic Council. He is an Iraq expert and author of Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution and the Founding of the Modern State. Most recently, he was a senior foreign policy fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies. Last but not least is Lahib Higel, senior analyst for Iraq at the International Crisis Group. She covers politics, governance, security, and conflict in the country. She has worked in Iraq and the Kurdistan region in various capacities since 2013. Most recently, she worked on mediation efforts in Iraq, Libya, and Syria for the Dialogue Advisory Group. Moderating the session today is AGSIW President Ambassador Douglas Silliman. He previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019 and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2014 to 2016. Previously, he served as a senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the U.S. State Department, working on Iraq issues and the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. He was Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in Iraq and Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in Baghdad from 2011 through 2013. And with that, Ambassador Silliman, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I want to welcome all of our guests. Rend, Abbas, Lahib, I'm very pleased that we have you. And I think you as the audience will be very happy to have this group with us today. As somebody who spent a lot of the last couple of decades looking at Iraq and serving and living in Baghdad, I've seen in the past few months a lot of new things that seem a little bit different from what we did in the past. The first of this was the victory in the elections now almost 11 months ago by Muqtada al-Sadr's party, winning 73 seats, the largest number of seats, and his attempt to form a national majority government, a new concept in Iraqi politics, at least since 2005. We also saw the development of what defined itself as the blocking third, a group of parties that did not want a majority government to be formed without their participation, and were able to use parts of the constitution to prevent Sadr from achieving his goals. We have seen real divisions within the Kurdish political class. You have divisions between Erbil and Suleimania, but you also have divisions within the major parties themselves. And it made it impossible for Kurds to choose one candidate for president. It also made it impossible for Kurds to do what they did in 2018, which was to permit a competition in Baghdad for presidency between a KDP candidate and a PUK candidate. When Muqtada al-Sadr was not able to form the government on the timeline he wanted, we saw him force the resignation of his MPs, which removed from the Sadrists most of the institutional power that he had gained in the elections, and forced him to go back to the street, call his people into the street when the coordination framework was going to try to form a government that would not be in keeping with what Sadr wanted, to occupy parliament and prevent that from happening. And also interesting for me, the concept of the three presidencies, which I have been talking about for a long time: the president of the republic, the prime minister, and the speaker of the parliament, seems now to have morphed into the four presidencies, with the addition of the head of the federal Supreme Court, including in a very interesting photo I saw a couple of weeks ago with Barham Saleh, Mustafa Kadhimi, Mohammed Halbusi, and Faik Zaidan sitting around a table the way you used to see the three presidents sitting around a table themselves. So here in Washington, there is a great deal of confusion. A lot of people have mistaken Sadr's neither East nor West idea as being anti-Iranian. And there were a lot of people in Washington, and I think in Europe and elsewhere, who wanted to see Sadr succeed in forming a majority government for the main purpose of minimizing Iranian influence in the country. We'll talk about that some today because I think it is an overly simplistic read of Sadr's motivations and his relationship with Iran. But we have got a stellar panel today, and I'm sure that at the end of this hour and a half, all of these complex questions will be answered clearly, and the path forward for Iraq, at least in the minds of the people in this group, will be very, very clear. So I want to start this conversation with Lahib, and I want to ask her to do a better job than I just did of running down what has happened in Baghdad for the past month or 6 weeks and how we got to this crisis point where we had the parliament shut down, violence in the Green Zone, and fighting between Shia militias in the Green Zone.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you for organizing this very timely panel. So I don't need to do as big of a recap because you mentioned some of the key moments that have led to the crisis that we're seeing now. Of course, it started with the elections where the Sadrist won, essentially with double the seats than the second winning party, the State of Law coalition of Nouri al-Maliki. And the difference, I would say, between the largest party and the second one within the Shia house came as a shock to those parties that have since organized in the so-called Shia coordination framework. They did not accept the idea that Sadr put forward of a majority government, including the KDP and the Sunni Sovereignty Alliance, and therefore formed the so-called blocking third or protective third, as they themselves call it. Now, the second most important, I think, incident that has really blocked the rest of the process was the clarification or the ruling by the Federal Supreme Court on the 2/3 quorum requirement to elect president. Although that is already enshrined in the Constitution, it rendered it impossible for Parliament to even convene the session or attempt the election of a president. I believe that they fell short by some 15 seats. The KDP, Sadr, and the Sunni Alliance managed to gather 202 out of 329. So very close to it, but not quite there. Now, the problem with this, I should say, too, is, of course, that we're going to have a similar issue after every future election if it remains in its current shape, considering that it's very unlikely, unless we go back to the consensus tradition where all political elites join in the government, it's going to be very difficult to see a government formed based on 2/3 or slightly more than that. Sadr then made the decision of withdrawing his 73 parliamentarians. I think that move was intended as a message to his opponents to invite them to a new understanding, whatever that could have been. He's tactically withdrawn from politics before. He said it several times after and not really been able to. Instead, his opponents in the framework went ahead with replacing those MPs. They also nominated a candidate for the premiership, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, which is seen to be close to Maliki. They would have known that that name would have been unacceptable to Sadr. And it also coincided with a series of audio leaks where Maliki states that he is preparing to fight Sadr or arming groups in the south, among many other things. I think that these moves in combination really triggered Sadr. And I think that what we've seen in terms of escalation after that is also quite telling of how the framework parties haven't necessarily been in agreement about these steps taken. So some of the leaders within the framework cautioned against the idea of replacing Sadr's MPs, knowing that that would provoke him. Then, of course, came another turn to the story, which I think that no one expected, and not Sadr himself either, which was the statement or the resignation or early retirement of Kadhim al-Ha'ari, who is sort of the spiritual or religious guide for many of the Sadrists and some other Shia as well. Not only did he retire, which is quite unconventional for a marja', he also encouraged his followers to instead emulate Khamenei in Iran. Now, Sadr, of course, now sees this as an attempt to strip him of the religious legitimacy that he has played on throughout his political career. And then what followed, obviously, were these clashes inside the Green Zone. I think there's one important thing to note with these clashes was that despite the death toll of a few dozens, several hundred injured, it was still a limited fight. It included essentially a small group of pro-Iran paramilitaries, including Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, and a couple of others against Sadr's Saraya Salam. The framework parties for a long time have been frustrated with, especially the current prime minister, that they've seen as some sort of protector of Sadr. He did not command the security forces inside the Green Zone to move against the crowd, but rather to sort of manage the crowd. And so when the protesters, after a few weeks, then moved to the governmental palace, or the former presidential palace, that was seen as a, symbolically even moving towards the executive branch when they had already occupied parliament, had protested outside the federal Supreme Court. A few things happened, of course, during those hours. It escalated to attacks also from outside the Green Zones, with mortars, rockets being lobbied into the Green Zone. But it seems also like that there were a few external actors that also came in and intervened to calm the situation. Grand Ayatollah Sistani, one of them, potentially a few regional countries that have, and I mean within the sort of transnational community of Shia political elites, that have already communicated to all sides that they should be de-escalating the situation. Now, Sadr, in his speech in the day after, despite apologizing to the Iraqi people, and his speech largely being welcomed by many of Iraq's political elites, including Barham Saleh, the president, the prime minister, and also leaders within the framework, his olive branch was not met by the same conciliatory rhetoric, specifically from two leaders, and that is, let's say, call them his arch enemies, former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and Qais al-Khazali. And so what we've seen happen in the days and the weeks, 10 days that have followed since, is that the tensions are not really at a low still enough to sort of pave the way for serious dialogue. But I would still say that the conflict for now is quite limited to these groups. It is clear that the wider Shia political spectrum is not interested in a conflict. Now the question is then, how do they take it from here, whether that is towards new elections or some sort of other interim government solution. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lahib. Rend, I want to come to you next, because one of the things that struck me as interesting was after most of the Sadrists had left the Green Zone, there were marches reprising some of the ideas of the Tishreen protests. And I know that Sadr has also tried to make himself out as a reformer. So if you would be willing to talk to us a little bit about where Sadr's ideas, or where Sadr has tried to appropriate some of the ideas of the Tishrinis, but where these ideas come together, where they have the same goals, but where those goals actually diverge.
Well, Doug, thank you very much for organizing this event, and thank you for inviting me. I wouldn't actually say that Sadr is adopting the ideas of the Tishrinis. I would say that actually Sadr is adopting the vocabulary and the language of Tishrinis, because saying that he adopts their ideas, in a sense, implies that there is a coincidence between what they believe and what he believes. And I don't think that is the case. But what I think Sadr has shown is that he has a very good ear for the sentiment of the Iraqi street. And whatever his other attributes are, he is tuned to the tenor, the timbre of the popular protests that have been going on. Now, we have to remember that the protests in Iraq did not originate in 2019. They started as far back, at least the largest ones started as far back as 2011. And it was very interesting because that was the year of the Arab Spring. And when protest started in Basra in 2011, and they actually managed to unseat the governor of Basra at the time. There was some thought that this might spread, but in fact it was limited. But in subsequent years, there were popular protests in many of the southern provinces. The other thing that is very noteworthy is, as you know, that these protests have all been, or mostly been, certainly the largest ones, have been in the southern provinces, in Baghdad and the southern provinces. And this is precisely where Sadr's constituency is. This is precisely where his audience is. So his ability to listen to that population and to their demands and to their language really adds to his ability to sort of manipulate and to control. But to go back to the actual sort of language and so on that Sadr uses, often Sadr's language has echoed the demands of Shia protesters in the southern provinces and has turned them into a political tool that serves his purposes. Now, from the very beginning, the protesters have asked for reform, Islah, and an end to corruption. And this was not something that Sadr created, but it was started in 2015. If one goes back to the records and listens to what the protesters were saying in 2015 in Baghdad, Basra, and other southern provinces, reform and anti-corruption sentiment was expressed by the vast majority of the population. So Sadr at that time must have caught on and adopted that language because Islah became the key word that he started using in his public speech. And when we go back to 2016, for example, and remember 2016 was the first time that the Sadrists were ordered by Sadr to go into the green zone and go into parliament and engage with parliamentarians. But the 2016 Sadrist protests came under the banner of Islah, reform, and anti-corruption. But at the time, it really wasn't at all clear what Muqtada Sadr meant by Islah, and it wasn't clear what he meant, and the tools at his command were limited. So, for example, in 2016, what he meant by Islah was only the shuffling of Haider al-Abadi's cabinet and some cosmetic changes in the government. That was what he meant by Islah at the time. There was nothing greater than that. There was no larger objective. The real turning point was in 2019 when the Tashrinis began to ask for not just reform, but radical reform. In other words, they wanted not only an end to corruption, they wanted end to muhasasa, they wanted, famously said, you know, nurid watan, we want a homeland. The implication is we want a homeland in which we feel like citizens, real citizens. They wanted an end to sectarianism. And of course, they wanted an end to vassalage, taba'iyya. In other words, you know, we do not want Iran, and equally, we do not want America. So this language started as far back as 2018 among protesters, but it really crystallized in the 2019 protests. And one thing to remember is that when the protests started, they were started by civic groups, by young people, by liberals and so on. Towards the end, they were infiltrated by the Sadrists. Towards the end, the Sadrists tried to co-opt the Tashrini movement, not just in Baghdad, but in other provinces, and particularly in Nasiriyah. And at the very end, the Sadrists began to suppress violently the Tashrinis through what was called at the time the blue caps of the Sadr movement. These were violent people who often killed the protesters, at least, and imprisoned them. In any case, the ultimate call of the protests in 2019, the pinnacle that they reached, was the expression, we want the current the regime to come down. We want inha an-nizam. We want to end this political regime. So the protesters were no longer talking about reform. They were talking about ending the current regime. So the Sadrist movement in 2020 began to internalize this much more radical and revolutionary move. And what we found, and I'm trying to skip here but move forward, what we found, for example, in the protest of 2022, when the Sadrists occupied Parliament, Sadr on July 31st, and for the first time, began to use the language of revolution. He issued a statement in which he called the Sadrists who were in Parliament revolutionaries. He called the movement a revolution. And so he had dragged the vocabulary of the Tashrinis all the way into the Sadrist movement and appropriated it, appropriated those words, appropriated, if you want, these ideas, these slogans into his movement, and it became the Sadrist demand and no longer just the Tashrinis demand. Now, of course, this puts the Tashrinis in a big bind because, after all, Sadr was part and parcel of the political order. The Sadrists from 2010 were in Parliament and in ministries. In 2018, let's remember, the Sadrists were the largest bloc in Parliament. They had only 54 seats, but they were nevertheless the largest bloc in Parliament. It wasn't just in 2021. So, and they had ministries, they controlled directors general, they were equally involved in any of the corruption, the malfeasance that contributed to the decline of state institutions. But they were using the language of outsiders, of people who had nothing to do with what happened in the past. They were the ones who were calling for political revolution, dismantling the political order. So for the Tashrinis, there's a real question of the sincerity of Sadr and his movement in using that language. And we have found that many Tashrinis have in fact distanced themselves from Sadr. Some of them have gone along on the assumption that, okay, we hear the right language, we will judge you by your actions, but for the meantime, we will suspend our doubt. We will suspend disbelief because we want to see how far you're going to go with this. But many Tashrinis really feel that the Sadrists were part of this whole corrupt system, and therefore they can't possibly go along with Sadr and his movement, that they remain suspect, that they are part of the entire order that should be dismantled. So this is where really the question of ideas becomes a critical question. To what extent does Sadr believe in those things that he's saying? To what extent does he believe in those slogans, that vocabulary, and to what extent is he simply using it as a political tool against his opponent and to increase his base? One more point I want to make, Doug, if I may. What is really astonishing is how tone deaf the coordination framework has been. Because the coordination framework in its statements, certainly in the statements that were issued in late July and early August, has continuously talked about protecting the political system, protecting and defending the Constitution, protecting and defending the institutions of state, as if these were not precisely the institutions and the system that the Tashrinis wanted dismantled and that had been discredited among a very large swath of the population. The coordination framework seems to have completely not heard what the Iraqi population is saying and has really neither seen nor heard what is going on among the vast majority of Iraqis. So I'll stop here.
Rend, thank you very much. And I think that sets up Abbas quite nicely. Abbas, I'd like you to talk a bit about the Shia house and the divisions within the Shia house. What does Sadr actually want in your view? What is the impact on Sadr and his influence of the resignation letter of Ayatollah Ha'iri? And as Rend was starting to talk about, how does the coordination framework deal with the loss of what up to this point has been the understood basic solidity of Shia unity in the country? How is this going to change Shia politics? So many questions, but Abbas, I'll let you take a crack at some of them.
Thank you very much, Doug, and hello, everyone. These are important questions. I must preface it with the indicating that the division and fragmentation among the Iraqi political leadership or elite is not only within the Shia. This is also a phenomenon that we see among the Kurds and among the Sunnis as well. Indeed, the most problematic gridlock that brought us to where we are today is not the Shia division more, it is really the inability of the two Kurdish major parties to agree on a president. And that's what led people to go to the Supreme Court and get this series of decisions that ended up complicating the issues. And that is important. Also, the Sunnis have their own disagreements on who gets to be the speaker. There are divisions among them. The only difference is that the differences or the divisions over the presidency or over the speakership, they are flashes, they go fast. Because we don't have, unlike the Shia division, which has to do with the government formation and the identifying the prime minister, first, the importance of this position, but also it takes more than 45 days to get to unfold. And it also starts way before the others. So that's important. I believe that what happened here is we have an always fragmented Shia house. The reason why, for example, the coordination framework are in the minority now is because they competed against each other in the elections. Unlike the Sadrists who are unitary, when we talk about the coordination framework, it is really made out of several entities. Each one of them presents itself as the speaker on behalf of the Shia or as the representative of the Shia. And this is not just in today or even in the post-2003. This has been a long time in play. And the differences and sometimes the competition among them hinders and prevents cooperation. I do remember from my old flashbacks when we were fighting in the uprising in 1991, and most of the people involved today were in the opposition. For over a month, we were fighting inside Iraq, and they failed to agree on a place to meet to see what they could do for us. And then when they finally agreed to meet in Beirut, the uprising was already over. So their final communique was to eulogize and say some words of sorrow about the end of that great opportunity. It is their modus operandi, and unfortunately, it hasn't changed a lot once they took power, and they are now leading the country collectively. So what was the crux of the disagreement? I mean, I would not repeat what the excellent presentations or articulation of the situation Ambassador Rend al-Rahim and Lahib Higel just said. What I'm going to do is this. Is to really present the arguments. In the past, the Shia competed with one another in the elections, and they also tried to compete internally to see who gets the prime minister job. But when they go to the session in the parliament to decide who gets to be the prime minister, they cluster together pragmatically, because they know if they go separately, they will lose. And the only way to move forward is to have safety in numbers and enjoy that. This time, Muqtada al-Sadr kind of really changed the rules of the game. He wanted to be the representative of the Shia and push Maliki and the others to either out of politics with Malik and Khazali, and also the others were welcome to join, but as followers of the largest winner or the biggest winner, al-Sadr. Now, everybody noticed that, of course, for Maliki and the others who were to be excluded, and he even hinted at taking them to courts and holding them accountable, for them, this was an existential fight, not only politically, but even for their own personal future. For the others who ended up being in the coordination framework, they found themselves safer and they could really retain their relevance and their powers, whatever they possessed with Maliki. But with Sadr, they could not retain that. Sadr was going to welcome them to go along, but not really to participate in the decision-making or anything. So they preferred Maliki to Sadr because of that. And they ended up having this. They were helped also by two things. One of them is the Kurdish division, because the Kurdish division alienated the PUK, the Suleimaniya wing of the Kurdish politics by, Masoud Barzani wanted to take the presidency from them. So they joined the coordination framework's position, and that enhanced their ability to get that 1/3 that Lahib just mentioned earlier. And also Al-Busi had some differences with some of his fellow Sunni politicians, and that made it. The coordination framework from the Shia side could not by itself really have that 1/3. So it was really some kind of the tripartite coalition that was framed by Sadr, Al-Busi, and Barzani contributed to the rise of this third, because at each ethno-sectarian group there was a rivalry that was irreconcilable. The argument from Sadr is that, look, we were trying to have this consociation and muhasasa, and quota system, etc., and it really did not take us anywhere. We are sinking in corruption deeper and deeper, and so we need reform, and the only way for reform is to have this vision of a national unity government. That was the slogan. Again, I will only defer to what Ambassador Rahim just mentioned about the actually are the Sadrists really innocent of whatever happened in the past years. That's a big question, but that was their presentation, and we take them for their word. The coordination framework had a different argument. They said, well, look, it doesn't make sense what you are doing here, because if we go back to the constitution, the Sunnis and the Kurds don't even have an entitlement to the presidency and to the speakership. These are up to vote according to the constitution. And if you really go by vote and by the rules, all three will go to the Shia. The Shia magnanimously said, we need to build trust, and we need to make the Sunnis and the Kurds feel they are included and they are participating and they are contributing to the leadership of Iraq. We give them these positions. So and then we retain the prime minister's position. So what the Kurds right now are doing, they say, you don't interfere in our choice for president. You don't interfere in the choice of the Sunni speaker, and we will come and we decide who your prime minister will be, and we will be in a coalition that takes some of the Shia out, and they found that their constitutional entitlement are eaten up as the time goes by people who have no entitlement whatsoever to get even what they are given. That was it's not me talking about that. This is what the argument actually from the coordination framework. They said, fair enough, we gave them the presidency, we gave them the speakership. We need to, as all Shia, because this position is for the Shia, it's not for Sadr, it's not for Maliki, it's not for Amri. This is a position for the Shia. Therefore, it has to be decided by a bloc that would have all the Shia. Again, this is their argument. Is it what they are doing? Again, I told you earlier that mainly this would not have been brought us bringing us, to where we are today, but it is the real motive is the existential fight that they are seeing ahead of them if Sadr were to agree with Barzani. Now, to be honest with you, all of this fight has nothing to do with the Iraqi people, has nothing to do with the governance or with the challenges that Iraq is going to face, has nothing to do with what to do once a government is formed. It is all about personalities, who get to be in this position or who get to be in that position. If you were to think about the tripartite coalition that was going to get the majority government, they agree on nothing other than basically forming a government and pushing Maliki away. Once a government is formed by Sadr, Halbousi, and Barzani, these people are going to go in three different directions once a government is. Barzani, we know what he is looking for. He is looking for the Kurdistan agenda. The top ceiling of it is independence, and any lower ceiling is going to be issues that are Article 140 on the Constitution and the oil and all of the other things. Sadr is more interested in creating that majority government that will lead Iraq in a different direction than the Muhassasa. And then Halbousi really is, again, the Sunni politicians as a minority, they don't have much clout in the parliament other than the speaker's clout to really lead Iraq in a certain direction. You will see three different conflicting philosophies. Same thing with the coordination framework today. If they were to form a government tomorrow, indeed before they formed the government, you started seeing the cracks of each one having their, they are a coordination framework, not a unitary group, unlike Sadr. So some of them are close allies to Iran. Some of them are they are not very close to Iran. They indeed, even probably they don't want a very close relationship with Iran. Some of them are on the moderate part or section of the Iraqi political spectrum. I mean, some of them have armed groups. Some of them don't. Some of them want armed groups. Some of them don't want. And one thing in common among all of them is they all want to have the prime minister from their own circle. And again, I think what clustered them together, the glue that they have, which is the existential threat, once it is out, and this we've seen it immediately after the resignation of Sadr or Sadr's parliamentarians. They began to really compete within themselves because they see now there is no threat. We are really looking at two groups of politicians, two wings of Iraqi Shia politics. Both of them have no vision for the future. Both of them have no governance plan. Both of them have no interest even in tackling the tough and recalcitrant Iraqi challenges that are there on services, on foreign relations, on the economy, on many other things. All what they are really trying to do is to agree on how to allocate these positions to personalities and then to the personalities' respective coalitions or parties. And that is really not a recipe for that would call us to be optimistic on how this is ending. To be honest with you, it is for quite a while I thought it is better not to form a government under this kind of dispute, under this kind of process, than to have a government. At least the government right now that is there, if given some authorities, can accomplish something. I believe that any government formed in within this environment, it will not last for long. I'll stop here.
Abbas, thank you very much. And Lahib, I want to come back to you and think a little bit more institutionally, because Abbas has kind of described how Sadr has helped to break the mold of the new traditional Iraqi political formation, how that has changed the way that some of his opponents in the Shia house have worked. So do you see anything in what has happened in the past few months that is going to move into the future? Will other people now try to be Sadr to bring power to themselves. And from one question from James Downer, this blocking third, this guaranteeing third, is this a problem? And does this now give people in the future an ability to reprise the blocking third until they get what they want? So again, institutionally, how do you think this will shake out going forward?
Well, maybe first to draw on something that Rend mentioned that I think is very important, is that it seems like the parties within the framework are quite tone deaf to the grievances and the desires of the population at large. What we've seen evolving over the last few months has really been an intra-elite competition or fight, right? It doesn't really speak to the average Iraqi, apart from the rhetoric of Sadr. Now, Sadr, I think that his main motive is, of course, to become the dominant leader, not only within the Shia house, but to dominate Iraqi politics at large. I would say that he would have hoped to repeat what Maliki managed to do during his 2 terms. Iraqis often refer to the so-called deep state or the extended arm of Maliki into state institutions. Sadr started building his own deep state through the Kadhimi government. He has had several of his kind of senior leadership people in high levels of government offices of the executive branch. And this already before elections was concerning to the framework parties. Now, on top of that, he is seeking to form a government that excludes them. And I do agree, sorry, I don't remember if it was Rend or Abbas that mentioned this, but even when he sort of was reaching out to the other side, to some of the moderate leaders within the framework, suggesting them to come on board, of course, he would try to put them in sort of a more junior partnership. I still think that that would have worked out just fine, considering that we have precedents for, consensus governance to the degree that we can talk about governance among these parties. They would have been able to split up the pie of government institutions quite well. But the problem is really the exclusionary rhetoric that we've seen over the last few months. And the framework parties have responded with exactly the same thing as Sadr did, and should have realized that this is not going to work. Now, okay, so where is that potentially going to take us? Again, I don't see that Sadr is a reformist in the sense that he is looking to the political system at large. He has spoken about constitutional reform. We still don't know what sort of reforms he means to amend. We also have a political system that, the protective third in parliament was supposed to protect minorities, right? So the Kurds, the Sunnis, and other minority groups from the potential of Shia actually coming together against the rest, forming a government on their own. Now, the interesting thing is that Iraqi politics have not evolved towards that scenario. And so we have a constitution that is not fit for other types of constellations. And I think this is, potentially something that is positive in Iraqi politics, right? That we have sort of moved away from the strict ethno-sectarian interest into other types of interests. What's unfortunate is that let's say the basis for politics, which would be to speak to different interest groups, whether you are, poor or middle class or sort of high earning strata, which is usually what governs politics in other parts of the world, is still non-existent within the political debate in Iraq. And I think unless these political elites start veering to speaking to those issues, they're not going to be very successful. I think as well that the debate of constitutional reform is needed. We know that this constitution is not serving the reality of Iraq today. The political system is in a way mendable, but also rigid in other ways, and it does not really politically right now leave space for these different groups to speak with each other. I'm pretty sure that the the Kurds specifically have been quite concerned about talk about changing the parliamentary system towards a presidential system, for instance. Although this is not, I think, realistic considering Iraq's history, it is quite clear that some sort of amendments to the constitutional or the political system are required. And then to come back to James' question, yes, I think that this is going to cause issues in the future. I think that there needs to be some sort of reconsideration of this two-third quorum rule, or perhaps in addition to how that can resolve the mechanisms for electing the presidencies in the future. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck at electing president for every future election that we will have.
Lahib, thank you very much. Rend, I want to come to you now and sort of draw on a couple of questions that we've gotten from Robert Friedman and Neil Patrick, generally about where Iran plays in all this, but more specifically, and maybe we can ask Abbas to comment on this later as well, whether Ayatollah Hayari's resignation and letter and condemnation of Sadr was because Iran sees Sadr as a real risk to its influence in Iraq. So maybe just first of all, where you see Iran's positioning in all of this, but then was the Hayari resignation a manipulation or a manifestation of Iran's discomfort with Sadr's actions?
Could I comment, please, a bit on what Lahib said? Because I think the current constitution has, over the last 19 years, shown itself to be, it does not serve a functioning state. It actually impedes a functioning state. And I think when it was written, there were different circumstances and so on, but now we have an accumulation of 19 years or rather 17 years of working with this constitution. And Iraqis know exactly where the problems are and where it impedes rather than facilitates. And so some kind of constitutional review to create a constitution that serves the state, serves a functioning state, makes it easier to work within the state and so on, is really needed. And in addition to this two-thirds that Lahib mentioned, we should also remember the issue of the largest bloc, because that has been a stumbling block in successive elections, starting in 2010, as everybody may remember. So the definition of what the largest bloc is needs to be addressed, among many other things. For example, the president now has very limited powers, which means that the Shia with the premiership have a lot of power. The Sunnis, because of the speakership role, have a lot of power. The Kurds have very little with the presidency in the person of the president. And so all of that perhaps needs to be reviewed with the accumulated experiences that we've had working within this constitution. I think that is a very important item on the agenda for the next year or two for Iraq. But let me go back to your question, Doug, about Iran and Iran's influence. Of course, really, since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the influence of Iran has, I wouldn't say receded, but sort of gone into a state of disarray. Ani certainly is not Qasem Soleimani. He does not have the authority. He does not have the personal relationship. He does not have the charisma. He does not have the special relationship that Soleimani had with Khamenei. And so, Qaani really is not able to do very much. We also have a resurgence of ittilahat in the Iraqi arena, ittilahat being the Iranian intelligence. So the ittilahat has emerged as, after Soleimani, has emerged as a counterweight to the Revolutionary Guard influence in Iraq. And the Revolutionary Guard does not now have the sole leverage in Iraq. The Itla'at also has leverage in Iraq. So in a way, it's a very different scene for Iran. This is compounded, of course. It's a chicken and egg story. Are we seeing a breakup of the Shia house because there is no Soleimani to hold it all together? Or is it the other way around, that the Shia house sort of broke up and Qa'ani can't put it together? I think actually that the breakup of the Shia house really started with Sadr walking away. Sadr is not as committed to obeying Iran's word as the other groups are. And indeed, I think since 2010, as Dr. Abbas hinted, there are several smaller Shia groups have decided to move away from Iranian control and Iranian hegemony. What we have now is primarily the Fasa'il, the PMFs, the Popular Mobilization Forces, who owe allegiance to Iran. The other Shia groups don't necessarily. The groups that are more sort of civilian have moved away from Iran. So Iran's role is weaker, I think, today. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some people may say this is a bad thing because this is what's causing the fighting between Sadr and the coordination framework. If Iran had the full control over all the Shia factions, we wouldn't have had bloodshed. Others, of course, say no. I mean, it's just as well that Iran doesn't have the same control, because it is about time that we get out of Iranian tutelage and the power. And if you look at the item that I was talking about, the topic that I was talking about, the Tashrinis, of course, really came out against Iran hegemony in Iraq. I mean, it was astonishing how before 2019, during 2019, and after 2019, all the Iraqi protests by the Shia population has raised slogans against Iran, has burnt Iranian embassies, has torn up pictures of Soleimani and other Iranian leaders. And Sadr himself, echoing this popular demand, has announced neither Western nor Eastern, either, in other words, neither the United States nor Iran. So there is a decline in Iran's ability to control the Shia house, if you want, with Shia factions. They may still have control on economic levels. They still have control, an enormous control over certain factions in the coordination framework. But it is clear that it has declined, it has weakened, it is not what it was 3 years ago. So to my mind, this is a good thing. And but I know some people think that it was much better when Soleimani could control all the Shia.
Thank you, Rend. Abbas, hold on just a minute. I want to take the second half of Robert Friedman's questions and pose it to Lahib. Essentially, how do you measure Iranian influence in Iraq? Because Rend just laid out a number of elements where Iran has been engaged in Iraq. But if you're in Washington, you're looking at some of the Fasa'il, some of the Hashid moving Iranian weapons across the country into Syria to support Hezbollah to eventually attack Israel. You see potentially a waning of Iran's political influence. But how do you, as an analyst, look at whether or not Iran is gaining, losing strength, and the various pieces that you would look at?
Okay, so I see a few different trends, in particular since after 2020. So I absolutely agree with what Rend was saying. The loss of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, not to forget the leader of the Hashid at the time, was significant. Many would question whether the escalation that we saw in the last few weeks would have happened had those two leaders still lived. And in particular, I think Mohandes that sort of had the ability of mediating between the Fasa'id. So two charismatic leaders are out of the way. No one, either in Iran or in Iraq, has been able to step into their shoes. And I think also with the Iran-US tensions being on the low since the new administration came into place, we've also seen that these groups are sort of grappling to find their raison d'etre. I mean, there is, okay, you can still attack sort of US interest in Iraq or elsewhere, but you sort of need more of that to sustain yourself. And so we've seen also a shift whereby these groups are now talking of another form of occupation, right? And that is the Turkish presence in Iraq. We've seen increasing attacks on Turkish interests, or the Turkish base in Nainawa, for instance. We've also seen increasing attacks on the Kurdistan region and energy infrastructure of the KRG, whether in the disputed territories or inside Kurdistan. So I think that these groups are facing an issue. And now that we've had a crisis in Baghdad, all of their efforts have moved into Baghdad politically, right? So most of these other attacks that we've seen at the start of the year are largely on the low. And then how do they relate to the political competition? And I hinted at that in my initial remarks. Groups like some of the hardline pro-Iran groups like Kataib Hezbollah has sort of stayed out mostly from the current competition that we've seen. They have not got themselves into clashes. They even withdrew their MPs from parliament. And I think that tells you quite a lot in terms of the priorities of these different groups. The main groups that are fighting Sadr are the leaders that were splintered off from the Mahdi army. So we're speaking mainly here about Qais al-Khazali and Shibl al-Zaidi. And these groups have been fighting each other for quite some time. There are sometimes strings of assassinations, and then they have to sit down and sort of figure out things between themselves. So there are some groups that are trying to consolidate their power inside Iraq. And I would say that Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq is one of the competitors to Sadr when it comes to that. Both and we're not speaking just politically, but also socially in terms of the public services that they carry out. Whereas an elite group or the commandos of the IRGC, if you want to call them that, Kataib Hezbollah, are not as interested in that type of work. Although they do it, it's not to the same extent. And as you mentioned, Doug, of course, I mean, they have other priorities in the sense of keeping sort of, the regional interests of Iran going through their transportation of weapons through Iraq into other countries of the region. So I think that Iran also uses these groups differently. At some point, they served a specific purpose. Back in the days, it was to temper, let's say, the power that the Mahdi army had built up. But now Iran itself is also facing the issue that some of these groups have grown politically quite powerful, and therefore have their own interests in Iraq, but also beyond. So I think we are going towards a more fragmented scene in general, not just in Iraq, but also across the region in terms of how these groups operate.
Okay, Abbas, I want to come to you, maybe starting out with a question from Ted Rea in our list about the difference between Arabs and Persians in Iraq and Iran, but that also falls over into the different approaches to Shiism. My broader question is, to what extent is Shia religious authority in either Najaf or Qum playing in this struggle, either to aggravate it, such as the resignation of Higel, or potentially, as has been made known from Ayatollah Sistani, who tried to get Sadr to disengage and move back. So, I mean, two questions: what is the role of the religious authorities in the two major Shia capitals of Najaf and Qum, and how do Arab-Persian differences play into the definition of Shiism, or how Iraqis see the role of Iran?
Excellent question. I normally don't see it in the ethnic dichotomy, Arab-Persian, because they are all Arabs. Whether it's Khamenei or it's Sistani, but they are Iranian nationals. So they are Iranians, but they are Arabs. Khamenei is an Arab. Same thing with Hairi, same thing with Sistani. They are descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. That's as Arab as anyone can be. But they are Iranians, so that's important. And by the way, also in that, there's an interesting thing to observe is that whether it's in Najaf or in Iran, they are all Iranians. The highest authority that we have in Iraq is Iranian. He is probably more Iraqi in his heart than most Iraqis. That's for sure. Sistani, and I had the honor of meeting him more than once. This man is more Iraqi than me. But he's an Iranian by nationality, and same thing with it. I think the difference is between two philosophies that developed under different circumstances. The Iranian philosophy on the relationship between the state and the religious authority, on the jurisprudence, on what we do in worship and transactions and all of that, they are the same. But on the political issue, there are two different philosophies. The Iranian philosophy that developed with more involvement in politics is because of the nature of the Iranian society that has a vast majority Shia. So whether the ruler is the Shah or the Qajar Sultan or the Safavids Shah, all of them were Shia as well. And so it's all Shia with Shia, at least since or in more than 500 years now, since 1501, if we were to put really the beginning of the Safavid Empire. In Iraq, it's different. Iraq, whether it was under the Ottoman or under the successive governments until 2003, and I would argue even partly until today, we don't have a Shia government in Iraq. We have a government with Shia participating in it. The decision is collective. But indeed, in Iraq, the Shia, while they are close to the 50% to nowadays more on a majority, they can't enjoy first the ability to advocate politics, and they did in the past. You mentioned in my introduction or introducing me that I wrote the book on the 1920 revolution. The ones who led that effort and oversaw it in Iraq in 1920 were the Shia Ayatollahs. Prior to that, the constitutional revolution in Iran was fought in Najaf intellectually, so it was a huge revolution that changed the nature of Iranian politics. The intellectual fight these were the days when Iraqis were meddling in Iranian politics. Indeed, even the form of government, the Shah, when he was coronated, the deal was struck in Iraq with the Grand Ayatollahs who are in Iraq. So it's that relationship, and I believe that it ceased with the deportation of the Grand Ayatollahs in 1924. And then their return with a pledge that they would not interfere in Iraqi politics under the monarchy. That kind of created this, what people refer to as quietist. It's not within the Shia theology or philosophy, political philosophy, not to interfere in politics, but it's a pragmatic position, recognizing that Iraq is not one shade of a sect. Iraqis, you cannot really impose the vision of Wilayat al-Faqih or something close to it on a population 40% of which is not Shia, and even the other 60% are not of one view that the Shia are not monolith also in Iraq. So I believe that's the thing here. But this is a philosophy that developed out of pragmatism, out of more of entrenched theological idea that Shia politics are dealing always since the Shia were in Iraq 1400 years ago, that the government was not Shia. So they had to really seek independence in their own authority, carve out their society and make it different than or separated from the rest of society, retain their independence financially and also politically, and work on their internal Shia community. And it continued. And this is the philosophy that ran in Iraq for at least in the last 100 years or so. So in a way, I think Najaf has been, back to the crux of your question, Najaf has been conducive to the stability of Iraq. Sayyid Sistani has been interfering only when he must, and all of his interventions were really helpful, whether his intervention to prevent the civil war after the bombing of Samarra Shrines, whether it is the intervention on when there were disputes over the constitution, his intervention most recently with ISIS, which really saved Iraq of a catastrophe and on the initial days. So he's been that, but he always tries to stay away because he doesn't want to lose the credentials and the credibility he has by backing one or another group, and both of them in the eyes of the Iraqis are seen as corrupt and no good. So what he does is he supports the entire process. He supports the Iraqi polity, he supports the constitution, he supports any consensus, but he would not take sides, at least in public. And that is why I think, I mean, he's limited in his choices. And since the government of Prime Minister Abadi, you were in Baghdad at the time, he closed his doors. And he is not meeting anyone, and he is saying, look, you know, I will only intervene when I must and when it is a catastrophic situation. I believe that his last message, even though it is not on record, to Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr helped a lot to diffuse the situation and the escalation. I believe that you know, again, the Iranian on the other side, you know, they have not been helpful for the stability of Iraq. You know, yes, they do support a lot on security, on many other aspects. They do support, they embrace the Iraqi change before anyone else. But it was done more for an Iranian agenda. And when it comes to their own interest, they've been using the Shia and Iraq, indeed, and all Iraqis as sandbags to really take the bullets that were directed towards Iran. In general, I think the two different views, two different modes of operation is that the Hausa is more interested in a stable Iraq where its constituents and also its network can live in peace, while Iran more is interested in the Iranian agenda, and Iran is one piece in the defense lines of Iran. And if there is a hit, then let the Iraqis take it rather than Iran. And that's why you see them sometimes are not very conducive to Iraqi stability, you know, in their goals and in their agenda and in their political operations.
Abbas, thank you very much. I have to leave it to Professor Greg Gauss to get to the crux of the matter. He's written a really good question, which is essentially, what is Sadr's end game? What is it that he actually wants to accomplish? And I may let anybody who's interested in answering this question answer, but Lahib, let me start with you. What do you think Sadr's goal is in running in the elections, in trying to form a majority government? What does he want for himself or his movement or for Iraq?
Well, I think I raised a few points towards that answer before. So I think in the first step, let's say, I mean, Sadr has building up his political power in Iraq since 2005. He's withdrawn from politics when he's needed to, but he's always had the ability to regroup. He has, let's say, one primary advantage over all other Shia political factions and perhaps everyone else in Iraq, which is that he has an extremely loyal crowd and highly organized one at that. I think that we've seen a few cracks in it, perhaps in the upper enclaves in terms of some of his recent decisions, But the more important and interesting one, I think, is the younger generation of Sadrists. So one thing that we saw happening during the Tishreen protests was that when Sadr turned against them in 2020, there were actually young Sadrists on the squares that did not agree to that, right? And so I think that there is a demographic of young Iraqis that are also the majority of the country, and this goes to all of them, whether Sadrist or not, that actually aren't as loyal to political elites as the older guard is. They also don't have, they don't embody the same kind of conflicts that the older generation has. Now, what does Sadr want to do with that? Well, I think that first of all, he is intent on replacing, let's say, those forces that have dominated Shia politics in Iraq before. That is primarily Nouri al-Maliki. He probably would like to expand his influence over government institutions and ministries that he has traditionally held, such as electricity and health, moving more into the executive branch, being the primary political actor that outsiders need to deal with in Iraq. And I think eventually he would obviously like to shape the future of the Iraqi state. And that one might be, as some interpret his rhetoric, to be more nationalist, an Iraq first policy, if you will, but at the same time, one that is religiously conservative. What would that mean in contrast to how other Shia political elites have dealt with the evolution of Iraqi society? I cannot be quite sure of that, but let's give one indication. Also during the Tishreen protests, when Sadr saw that the crowd was not behaving in the way that he would like them to, he suggested or demanded gender segregation on the protest sites. The young people, of course, didn't respond, but I mean, that gives you one indication of what type of leader I think he would be in the future. Would he dominate Iraqi politics?
Okay, Rend, if I can come to you and ask sort of a second part of Greg's question, but also go to what Lahib just said. Why did Sadr withdraw his members of parliament or ask them to resign when he couldn't get what he wanted? I saw this as a strategic mistake, but I am someone who is an institutionalist and likes, definable institutional power and don't have street power. So maybe the first question is, why did he do that? But more, the deeper issue that Lahib just touched on, there appear to be cracks in the Sadrist movement, differences of opinion in his MPs, some who did not want to resign from the parliament but did reluctantly, and some who have decided that Sadr is trying to control their protests and their movement a little bit too much, maybe on the edges of the movement. So maybe taking those two questions together.
Okay. So why did he resign? Well, first of all, I agree with you, Doug. It was a miscalculation. And I think what we saw happening subsequently were outcomes of that miscalculation and reactions by Sadr to the fact that he miscalculated. He needed to make up for it. First of all, it's very difficult to know what Sadr is thinking. I'm sure even his closest aides sometimes don't know. But it does seem as if you remember, originally he declared before the elections of October 2021, he declared that he was going to boycott the elections. The Sadr movement was going to boycott the elections. Everybody, including Asa'ib al-Haq, including Badr, including all the others, perhaps even Maliki, I don't remember, certainly the Kurds and the Sunnis, all of them went to him and said, no, please, you must participate in the elections. You can't withdraw. And of course, this must give him a certain kind of euphoria that everybody is afraid of his withdrawal and everybody's going to come and beg him. So I think when he withdrew his MPs from parliament, I think he expected two things. One of them is for everybody to rush over and say, no, 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 please repeal this decision. Go back on your decision. Your MP, we can't do without your MPs. They're an essential part of the parliament. They're a pillar of the parliament, etc. And in fact, nothing happened. Even his allies, KDP and the Sovereignty Alliance under Halbusi, did not publicly go and beg him to change his mind and reverse his decision. That must have been a blow. The other thing that I think he expected is that at least the KDP and the alliance would threaten to withdraw their own MPs if he withdrew his MPs. I mean, they were in this grand alliance with him, and if he withdraws his MPs, then the alliance will essentially break down. There will not be any alliance, and therefore, to confirm that they were with him, that this was a strategic coalition, they should withdraw their MPs. Of course, again, they did nothing of the sort. And what I meant by the withdrawal created a series of cascade events is that almost immediately Parliament convened. Halbusi, Sadr's ally, convened Parliament and allowed all 73 MPs to be replaced, including a very large number, I believe as many as 40 of those seats going to the coordination framework. Now, this must have been a terrible, terrible blow to Sadr, and it must have precipitated all the actions, the anger, the frustration, the resentment, and so on. So, but going back to the situation that existed at the time that Muqtada Sadr withdrew his MPs, you have to remember that two things happened. One of them is the one-third obstructionist one-third, which they call the protective one-third. Now, you know, whether this was put in place in the constitution in order to protect the Kurds, other minorities, is irrelevant. It was used in order to block the voting for the president, and therefore it blocked the entire political process, because you can't vote for a government until you have a president. And so if you block the vote for the presidency, you've really blocked the entire process. So that was frustrating. The other frustrating thing is that the issue of the largest bloc, and this is why I said, when we look at this, the how to amend the constitution, it's not only the 2/3 that has to be looked at, it's the definition of the largest bloc. That was used in 2010 to disqualify Ayad Allawi from becoming prime minister and forming the new government. And it was repeated again now with Muqtada Sadr. So there were two roadblocks that he faced, and yet he had these enormous ambitions to reform the political process, to create the majority government and so on. And he was being blocked in every direction. So the anger that must have been building up in his mind must have been tremendous. Now, going back to Greg Gause's question about what does Sadr want? I agree with everything Lahib said, but I want to go further. I think Muqtada Sadr wants to be the supreme power in Iraq. Simple as that. He certainly wants to be the supreme Shia authority, the supreme political authority in the Shia community. I think he also aspires to be the supreme moral authority. In other words, he may not have the theological qualifications to be an Ayatollah, not yet. That may happen in the future. But at least he wants to be the supreme moral guide. And if you look at all his pronouncements, not just the ones that he has put out during this political crisis, but if you look at more broadly at his statement on moral issues, on issues of individual conduct, he really wants to be a moral guide for the Shia. So, he wants to be the moral authority for the Shia. He wants to be the political authority for the Shia. And if you are the moral and political authority for 60% of the population, then effectively you are the supreme leader of Iraq. I think in the long run, this is where he sees himself. And depending on where you stand, because this could be a good thing or this could be a bad thing. I am sure he wants a much more religiously conservative Iraq, for example. I'm sure he also wants a much more nationalist Iraq, as Lahib said. I agree with that. Is that enough justification to accept Sadr as the supreme leader? That depends on your point of view. I personally think that his call for a majority government, although it has a lot of dangers in it, is in fact necessary and important to break this consensus government that we've had for the last 15 years. I think we really need to move into that. It is dangerous, it is risky, but at some point it has to happen. Now, that it's happening in the hands of Muqtada al-Sadr may or may not be unfortunate, I don't know, but we really need to move into a different model of government, and the obvious model is a majority government formed by the majority group, and everybody else should be in the opposition, because that's the only way we can break out of all the stalemates, the corruption, the cover-up, the division of the spoils that has really broken the Iraqi state.
Rahim, thank you very much. In the last minutes that we have left, I'm going to do one last round and key off of a question that we've gotten from Abdelnabi Al-Akri, essentially saying, is the best solution to break tensions now something imposed by the military? I want to broaden that question and then go to Abbas first. Over the course of this conversation, the three of you have suggested giving more powers to an interim government and just letting the deadlock go forward, various types of constitutional reform on the necessity of a 2/3 majority, or redefining the largest bloc, now some military intervention that will put things right in some way. Can you take one thing that you believe could be done and suggest it and explain how it might actually happen? In other words, if it is to throw Iran out of the country, that's really not a realistic solution. So Abbas, what is one thing that you think could help break this deadlock and move Iraq forward? And who needs to agree on that to get it to move forward?
Well, thank you. And hello, Abdelnabi. It's been a while. Here is the deal. I would never support a military involvement in Iraqi politics. This is something I would not see as in any way as positive issue. But back to your question on the one thing, I believe that we do need an early elections. No matter how this process plays out, an election, as I argued in a previous piece that I wrote, will not change the outcome of Iraqi politics. We are living under the tyranny of demographics. Iraqi parliamentary seats are divided among ethno-sectarianly or segregated provinces. There is very little number of seats that can cross the ethno-sectarian boundaries. But the major contribution of an early election is to bring the Sadrists back to the process legally and constitutionally. We already learned, and it should have been seen and predicted that the Supreme Court is not the right way to go and rectify what happened from Sadr's decision to withdraw. So a new election is important. How do you do the election? I think, we have three scenarios: either keeping this government, that's the easiest, but also it's more costly because the current government doesn't have the full authority, and a new election will take us to 1 year, probably 2 years until a new government is formed. With this current government that is stripped of all its authorities to govern is a bad thing. The other scenario, which I would prefer, is really to have a way to vote the same government in to give it full authority, with the understanding that is an interim government to run an election. This way, and of course, they already have about 5 vacancies, they can fill them. So it will look like a new cabinet, but also an interim cabinet, not for the rest of the parliamentary session. And then you will let the political leaders, the reason is because this government and Prime Minister Kadhim are not party to the dispute. They didn't run for election. They are not considered to be in the camp of one side or the other. And the Kadhim is liked by everybody outside Iraq as well. So this is basically a good way to keep him. The third scenario, which is what the CF wants, the coordination framework. They want the process to go according to the book, by the law and the constitution, and they form a government and they run an election. With the lack of trust, and also the new government being partisan, being part of the coordination framework, being part of the dispute itself, I think this will not give us, even if it's a year and a half or so until we get a new government, it will not be an easy ride for Iraq or for the formed government. So a new election with a government that is fully authorized and that is not considered to be in the pocket of, or at least in the camp of one of the disputants. That's what we need to do. If we were to think like statesmen, and if we were to put the Iraqi interest first rather than the sectarian or ethnic or factional interest ahead of everything.
Abbas, thank you. Lahib, 2 minutes, please. What do you think would be the best step to get Iraq out of the current political crisis, and how to accomplish that?
Yes, so I will actually reiterate what Abbas was saying. I agree that I think an election is important for a political reset, that not being a long-term solution, that has to be accompanied by a formalized or structured conversation on constitutional amendments. This is way overdue in Iraq. So I think those things in parallel can actually perhaps foster a more peaceful climate to continue politics in. And the second thing that I would mention, and that actually goes back to the previous question about Sadr, is one aspect that we haven't said anything about, and that is his desire to dismantle or at least deal with the Hashid institution in a way that it wouldn't pose a threat to him. Now, of course, this institution of paramilitary groups is problematic for other reasons. I think a way to go about that without threatening the other side, because this is really something that they see as an existential threat coming from Sadr, is actually to find a way to formalize or institutionalize this body that essentially acts like a ministry, but is not. It has no insight from the government or other state bodies that could, for instance, audit it even. So I think that would be, a better way to go forward with this, rather than to pick a fight with very, very powerful armed groups.
Thank you. Rend will give you the last word on what should happen to move this crisis forward.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. I agree with both Abbas and Lahib. I would add just one thing. If there's one thing that can diffuse the situation right now, is for Parliament and the political groups to actually set a date for elections. If one could say, okay, we are going to have elections on December 31, 2023, I think that would diffuse the situation very quickly. But it really is a process, as both of the other speakers said. After that one statement, other things must happen. I agree with Abbas. The current government should be empowered. The president should stay put, and the parliament should stay put until the next elections. But in the meantime, Parliament, of course, has to adopt certain laws on the elections, on the budget, and so on, look at the election law. But Lahib mentioned looking at the Constitution. Look, the Constitution is a product of political agreements. It is not just words on paper. You can't sit down and simply amend the Constitution. You have to first sit down, the political groups have to first sit down and understand what kind of Iraq they visualize and what kind of relationships they want to have to each other. And also they have to decide how the particular pieces of the state fit into each other, because right now the components, the institutional components of the state simply don't mesh. Okay, so before they even look at the Constitution, you need this dialogue. And I know it's a much used and abused word, but it really is necessary before you even start writing a Constitution. The Constitution will be the outcome of this dialogue. Okay, I think that year, sort of between now and December 31st, 2023, the Parliament has to get on with its business. The government is empowered to do its business and oversee elections. And at the same time, concurrently, you have to have a year-long dialogue among the active political groups, including, by the way, the Tashrinis. I think that's important. Civil society has to be part of this dialogue. Sorry, I took too long.
No, Rend, that was fantastic. Guests, thank you very much for joining us today, and to our three panelists, Ms. Lahib Higel, Dr. Abbas Kadhim, and Ambassador Rend Al-Rahim. Thank you for your insights, for your passion, and I really appreciate what you said, especially in terms of practical steps that might move the Iraqi political process forward. For all of you, this will be has been recorded. It'll be available the next couple of days on AGSIW's website, agsiw.org. And until next time, thank you very much. Have a good day.